Welcome everyone to today's Ninja special event. My name's Matt Cowdroy, or Ninja Matt, as many of you know me by. Today it's such a pleasure to have special guest Tim Hewson with us to talk about this extremely important topic of men's mental health. I would like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians and owners of the lands that we're all coming from today, many different countries or lands we're coming from. I am coming to you from, both of us, Tim and I, are not far apart. We're both coming to you from Guringai country, here on the northern beaches of Sydney. And I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners here for their ongoing work and work over tens of thousands of years in this space of mental health and culture, community, education, and would like to welcome any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people with us today. So welcome, welcome, welcome everyone. I would like to introduce Tim now. I'm going to stop the slide share. Tim Hewson, he's the founder of an incredible charity that I have benefited from, Mongrels Men, and also Tim's consulting business all around corporate and individual mental health called Betterment Consulting. Welcome, Tim. I'm going to tell us all a little bit about you. And then, as I promised, I'm not going to do much talking today. I'm going to hand over to you and just ask you some questions. But Tim has had a 27-year career working in corporate, many different financial institutions. He understands the pressure, the mental health implications of being under stress and pressure. So Tim is going to share a lot with us about that career and his experiences there, his lived experience there. But Tim also launched Mongels Men, which we'll be talking about today in 2021, a men's health charity for which he has won several awards, which we were just talking about before we started the recording. Now, Tim, I would like to hand over to you and say a huge welcome. And who is Tim Hewson?
Yeah, can I start by saying thank you for obviously having me on today, inviting me along to have a conversation with everybody that's obviously in the audience. So I'll start there. Who am I? I would probably describe myself as a mental health advocate. I'm fortunate enough to be the father of, I call them, three spirited teenagers. They're all at very interesting stages of their life. And then finally, maybe a hobby or an interest, a semi-proficient, non-professional, middle-aged footballer. How's that?
Perfect. Perfect. Thank
That's a
you.
good place to start. And in my spare time, in addition to running Betterment Consulting, which is focused on improving and empowering conversations around mental health and wellbeing, mostly in and around the workplace. I also run, as you've highlighted, a men's mental health charity called Mongrels Men Health and Wellbeing. For the purposes of keeping it nice and tight, let's just call ourselves either Mongrels Men or the Mongrels, just for simplicity.
Great. Thanks, Tim. Now, before we get into the conversation, I would like to also just mention that today we will be talking about some deep, potentially challenging subjects or some difficult subjects. So if this is difficult for some of you to hear today, or we'll be talking about topics such as suicide, and if this is difficult to talk about today, please feel free to step away from the computer or take care of yourselves as we have this very important conversation today. And we do. It's important we have the conversation, even though it can sometimes be challenging. Now, Tim, I would like to start by asking you, if you could please tell us about mental health in Australia. Tell us some of the stats, or yeah, get us involved in that conversation. Thank you.
Yeah, and thank you. I think part of the reason why we're having this conversation is because of the significance of the impact that it has on Australians. I mean, there's 50% of us will experience a mental health challenge at some point in our lifetime. That means 50% of our friends, our colleagues, our family, potentially the people on this call today. So, the more we can raise awareness, the more we can reduce the negative stigma around mental health, even poor mental health, good mental health, understanding the difference between that and everything in between. And probably most importantly, the reason why we focus on men is because of the impact that mental health has on men. We know that 1 in 4 will absolutely experience a diagnosed mental health disorder, not just a mental health challenge. 1 in 5 of us will experience anxiety. 1 in 8 will experience depression. But probably worst of all is the fact that we lose 9 Australians a day on average to suicide in Australia. 7 of them are men. And this is not something that's unique to Australia. We know globally men are twice as likely to die by suicide than women. We know in Australia we're 3 times more likely. And when we're talking about those numbers, unfortunately, it's the case that those numbers are what has been reported. And reported is important because it means that a coroner has undertaken a review of the cause of death. It's been determined as being a death by suicide. And we also know that there are 100 reported attempts for every death by suicide. So, the challenge is large. And probably the other reason why we focus on men, and it's important, is that we know that 3/4 of men, 75% of us, don't get professional help and support when we need it. And so that means that, the kind of things that we do with Mongrels Men provide other avenues of support or means for men to create support networks within their local communities.
Thanks, Tim. It makes me emotional just thinking about those statistics, and I do have personal experience of losing a friend of mine to ill mental health and suicide. And yeah, it's the statistics are frightening. So thank you for that. I'd love to hear some more about Mongrels Men, the charity that you've created, that you've founded. This is how I met Tim. I saw the banner down at DY Beach. I saw the Mongrels Men banner, and interestingly, I was like, what are those guys doing over there? And finally, then I saw you, Tim, at Westfield when you were in the running for the Westfield Local Hero Awards, which you won in the end. Congratulations. I saw you at Westfield. That's when we actually chatted. I felt more comfortable approaching you at Westfield at DY Beach for some weird reason. Anyway, I finally have benefited from going along to some of the Mongrels Men meetups down at DY Beach, where we walk along the beach, have a coffee afterwards, connect with fellow men, and it gets more and more comfortable every time I go because there's this challenge to get started. So thank you for that opportunity for me. But yeah, I'd love to hear more about Mongrels Men, please, if you could share that with all of us.
Thank you. And of course, Matt, you're welcome to come at any time. So Mongrels, we've been a charity for nearly 3 years. In fact, we will have officially been a charity in about 9 days. We would have been a charity for 3 years. And it's fair to say that over that period, we have learned a lot. We are dealing with blokes, so we do try and keep what we do simple. We operate 3 core programs around 5 pillars. But in that 3 year, and I'll go into a little bit more detail on that, but in that 3 years, we've grown from, a couple of blokes that have run up and down DY Beach, kind of sharing, connecting, talking, opening up about their challenges, to now what is, 12 locations across New South Wales and Queensland. We have the support of 15 amazing volunteers across all of those groups. They run collectively about 750 programs a year, and we impact about 7,000 men. We've done a study which provides us with some background around the impact that we've had. So it's really nice to see that we're not just spinning wheels, that what we're doing is truly having an impact on local community. But more importantly, we actually know that we have saved lives, and that the supportive networks of men that we've created have had that impact. Whilst we're a mental health charity that is focused on control, prevention and reduction of mental health disorders and illnesses like depression and anxiety and suicide prevention, we are quite simply a charity which is focused on getting blokes outdoors into fresh air, moving, connecting, forming new social and support networks within their local communities, and giving guys, somewhere to go, something to do, someone to talk to, and then support when they need it. if we talk about the kind of formal programs that we've got, our starting point is to build the community. And we do that with our community meetups. That's getting guys out of bed, getting them out for a walk and talk or a run or doing some exercise, getting them into sunshine, watching a sunrise. And it's amazing the impact that a sunrise can have on a bunch of blokes. But once we've built that community, we then stack information and education on top through what we call our doghouse workshops. And Matt, thank you. You've come along and presented at one of those to a group not so long ago here on the Northern Beaches. And the idea there is really simple. We want to improve awareness, improve the connection, but from an education point of view, we want guys to be able to tap into their toolbox and access those tools of resilience when they need them or when they need them to support others. And then the third program is our mental health response workshop. So think about that as being similar to mental health first aid, in that we're talking about mental health illnesses and building an awareness. We're then looking at signs and symptoms so that they can identify them, because we're talking about things that in many cases are not easy to identify. And then what to do, how to have challenging conversations, where to get support, tackling conversations around suicide. What happens if you find yourself in a situation where somebody is experiencing suicidal ideation or challenges? And then, of course, the importance of self-care and looking after yourself so that you can help support and look after others. So it's quite a simple kind of three-step integrated series of programs, and we leverage around these pillars of community, conversation, connection, movement, and of course, education. So that's kind of it at a high level. I'm happy to dig into kind of why those pillars, if that's of interest.
I think those pillars are so important, that you're coming at this challenge, getting men to open up, getting men to share, getting men to just even turn up, coming at it from those different angles is really, I think it's a really smart way to do it. And you've obviously done a lot of thinking there. The interesting impact on me from coming along to just a few of the DY meetups was I started to find myself being even more open and connecting with other strangers. Because I think we live in, and you mentioned to me before today that it's Loneliness Awareness Week. Did I get that right? Yeah, it's Loneliness Awareness Week. Just meeting those strange men, not that they're strange men, but strangers to me down at DY Beach, and then bumping into other strangers at the shops or walking down the road. It made me, and those that know me and have seen me do my work, I'm quite extroverted and positive, but there's still this fear around having a conversation with a stranger.
Yeah.
And it was interesting. It really started breaking down all those other barriers for me as well. So such a strong impact of just coming along for a few walks and a few cups of coffee, and you don't even have to run. That's the thing. You're very welcome to come and walk. You're very welcome my understanding is guys are very welcome just to come for the coffee if they're not even able to come for the walk. So it's just about getting together. So yeah, thank you, Tim, again for creating that opportunity. I'd love to hear a little more. We could certainly dig into Mongrels Men some more and those different pillars, but I'd love to hear, and I think it's important to share some of your personal experience as well from, what the positions you found yourself in and what you did about that and what sort of led to this passion, this passion, life purpose or passion of yours.
Yeah, I might weave a couple of things in. My own experience with and my mental health journey as one of the core reasons why Mongrels Men was established, but it wasn't just that. There was a couple of other things that were indicators to me that something needed to be done. And I'm conscious we've got a limited amount of time today, and I'm middle-aged, so I'm going to try and keep my story nice and short. But like at a high level, I think I was always challenged as a kid growing up with lots of worry, lots of paranoia as a teenager. All the way from making sure that when I turned up to school, I was wearing freshly polished shoes. My socks were pulled right up to the knees. The lines on my socks were straight down my shins. My shorts were freshly pressed. My belt buckle and my shirt buttons were aligned down the middle. I had to have the perfect wins nut. My hair had to be perfect. Otherwise, I couldn't
This
leave the
explains to
house.
me why you always are. This explains to me why you always still are very well presented. Yes.
And so
Anyway, sorry to interrupt.
that worry and paranoia as a teenager turned into textbook anxiety. And by the time I'm in my late 20s, I've got a great corporate job. And I'd turn up to my job taking it seriously about 7:30 every morning. I'd get in nice and early. I'd review the overnight markets, my client portfolio, check out what needs to be done, go to my sales meetings, my economic briefings. And then by 9:30, I was marching off to the bathroom for what was my first panic attack of the day. And I would literally put my hands against the walls and strap myself in while my mind was racing, my heart was beating out of my chest, I was sweating, I was nauseous, I was dizzy, and I had no idea what was actually happening to me or why. But the idea of just being able to strap myself in and ride out that panic attack gave me just this whisker of control that I could kind of get through it. If I hardened up, soldiered on, and sucked it up hard enough, that I'd eventually get through it. And so I lived with that every day for many, many years. And I'm pretty sure my colleagues at the time thought one of two things: either he's off for another pre-market nervous poo, or he's incredibly regular. But the fact is, it gave me somewhere to hide, and I could, walk out of the bathroom and just pretend that everything was okay. Roll the clock forward. I'm now in my 30s. I haven't done anything about my anxiety. I haven't done anything about my panic attacks. I've just continued to work hard, bury myself in the sand, my head in the sand, live with fear, shame, embarrassment, and ignorance. And of course, untreated, that then turns into what I now know was depression. Ultimately, if you were to ask my then wife, now ex-wife, and my three kids what that looked like, Dad's a workaholic. He's grumpy, he's irritable, and I'm pretty sure they would have called me an asshole from, on the odd occasion. But that was how it manifested for me. I was also going through and isolating myself. I worked hard all week. I thought my only role was to provide for my family, so that's what I focused on. And it didn't make sense to me because, I had modeled myself on what I thought I was meant to be, who I was meant to be, who I was actually taught to be. I wore a suit to work. I had a good job. I provided for my family. I looked after my kids. I was there when they needed me. And, this idea of you can't be what you can't see comes back to this challenge of a lack of male role models, in particular around things like vulnerable conversations that you mentioned before. So, I'm in my 40s by this stage. I finally figured out that I'd been living with this for 20 years or more and that I needed to do something about it. It coincided with when I was going through separation, and I did seek out some professional support and still use professional support. But that was a pivotal moment for me because I had lived with 20 years of fear, shame, embarrassment, a lack of knowledge, support, awareness of what was actually happening. And to be honest, I actually didn't want to ask the question because I didn't really want to know. I didn't want to think anything was wrong, although I knew something was really wrong. And I wanted to decide at that point in my life, what kind of man I wanted to be. So, was getting professional support. I was reaching out to female friends to help me because, to be completely honest, everything I learned about meaningful conversations, I learned from the dominant women and female friends in my life. With blokes, it was, Tim's now single. Let's hit the town. He needs a wingman. And of course, that would be fun. But you'd wake up the next morning feeling like nothing had been resolved. We haven't talked about anything, and a lot worse than the day before. My female friends gave me someone to talk to. They asked thought-provoking questions. They listened. They validated. They asked about my emotions and they validated them. And they introduced me to things like whole foods and self-care checklists. Excuse my French, but with guys, it was all beers and bullshit. With women, it was coffee, self-care, and conversations. And so I very quickly came to this conclusion that men and women operate very differently. And a friend of mine reached out, got me walking and talking on DY Beach. And that started off this aspect, this idea of me trialing these meaningful conversations with other blokes so I could actually share my challenges. At the same time, I referenced myself as a middle-aged footballer before. I was managing a team of middle-aged footballers. As one of the many benefits of being the manager, I got to organise the end-of-year event, and we'd had another successful season. We're out celebrating. And one of the guys came up to me and he said, "Thanks for organising for me to turn up every week." And I made a joke about being the manager and the oldest player in the team and how managing and washing bibs and bringing oranges was the only way I could secure my spot and get some time on the field. And he threw his arm around my shoulder and he pulled me in really tight. And he said, "No, seriously, if you didn't organise for me to be here, to turn up to training, to turn up to the games and have the support of the team around me, I wouldn't be here." And so standing in front of me was a guy that had been contemplating taking his own life for 9 months. We step over the white line, we play as a team, we support one another, we step off the field and we don't dig deep on the stuff. We'd missed it completely. And so two things. How do we get better at helping support men? How do we get better at actually opening up conversations so that we can identify when someone's challenged and struggle and might be struggling? And what was it about the middle-aged men's soccer team that was so powerful? So, my own lived experience, the impact of being hit by a sledgehammer by this idea of, another football player in the team that we spend 4 hours with a week, considering taking their own life and having missed it. What I'd learnt from females by way of meaningful conversations, looking at all of the conversations I was having with guys around me and realising it needed to be done better. But then you look at those statistics I was talking about before and you go, all right, well, I'm kind of doing something in this area. How do we scale it up? How do we turn this into something more impactful and purposeful so that we can change the way men behave and make them more open to conversations to help try and solve some of those statistics that we talked about? I'll pause there because I realise I've just been talking for a while. As I said, I tried to weave in a few different aspects of my life.
I promised I wouldn't interrupt. I think, thanks, Tim. I think what really touched me there was you said having missed it, having missed, the fact that this friend in the soccer team was in that situation. And I think that's often the situation. We do miss it. I missed it with my friend, who I lost, and it's like, how did we all miss that? And I think that's why it's so important to be bringing these conversations proactively forward. A couple of things came up for me. They're talking about being middle-aged like I am. I've probably noticed the average age of the people I see coming to Mongrels Men is probably 40, probably early 40s. I don't know if you've got those stats, but it got me wondering, how do we get the 20-year-olds coming along? How do we get the younger people coming along? Which leads me to a question for you. By the way, everyone, we did advertise this conversation today would be about 45 minutes long, so we are planning on pushing through that. I know some of you will probably leave at 12:30, but there will be a recording that I'll make available this afternoon as well. But we're going to push on for another 15 or 20 minutes or so. But Tim, it leads me to this conversation around how can we support men? We've got a whole range of genders with us today. How can we support men better? What can we do to provide men in our communities, in our families with more help? How do we reach out? How do we? Yes, there's charities that we can go along to. There's men themselves can reach out, but for all of us here today, what can we do? It seems hard for me and for some of us. Yeah,
it's challenging, right? Like, these are not easy conversations, and I think this concept of it's hard to be what you cannot see. If you haven't been taught, then you've never learned how to behave any other way if you're a man than to kind of soldier up, soldier on, suck it up, harden up. And most blokes on this call have probably been told to drink a glass of cement at some point in their life. So first and foremost, we kind of need to change the narrative. We need to shift from this concept of man up and hardening up and soldiering on to speaking up. And it's great to be able to reposition that, but that's not easy to do, because we know that 38% of men do not like talking about their emotions because they just feel that it is unmanly. So this concept before that I talked about of not having male role models, well, we've all got a role to play when it comes to digging a little deeper, scratching underneath the surface and having more challenging conversations. And if I think about most of the blokes that come to us, 60% of them have come to us because a dominant woman in their life has said, you need some new social connections, you need a bunch of blokes to hang out with, you need to get outdoors and get moving and go for it. So, that's wives, sisters, female colleagues, aunties, mothers. We increasingly get questions about an age limit. Is there any age limit to come along to Mongrels? And I say, well, no. I mean, we target men between the ages of 20 to 70 because they're the demographics that we know are most impacted. But we also know that there's an increasing challenge arising with youth. We do get family, we do get youth involved in some of our programs, in some of our events and activities. But we try and also create this brave space for men because the challenges that youth would face are very different to those of men. And as you quite rightly pointed out, a lot of them would be around the average age of 40. That's when life's pressures kind of start to mount, work, family, just social, economic and financial pressures. And of course, it's an age group that I understand very well and when some shifts occurred for me. But I think it's also when you kind of start to look up and ask yourself questions around what's valuable and what you need. And when you're stuck in, I'm just going to say that, the hamster wheel of life, it's not until you're 40 that I think as a man you've matured enough to be able to ask those questions and realize that something needs to be done. I think, the other aspect here of what and how we can support men, in addition to programs like ours, we try and keep it very informal, unstructured, take away all the hurdles, just give them somewhere to go, someone to talk to, create new support networks within the local community so that it's always on, always accessible. They can turn up when they want to. There's no membership, there's no costs. We'll buy you a coffee because we figure that for the price of a cup of coffee, getting a couple of blokes talking is kind of powerful. And you touched on this before. It's a little bit about trust. They build trust after developing rapport and they start to open up. And if we're talking about what we can do to support men, I think it's just giving them a bit of a brave space to speak up, listening when they do talk, validating emotions. Blokes find it very hard to do that. They just want to fix stuff. And so there's, this concept of always leaving the door open for a conversation. Most blokes would slam it shut, but if you actively listen, if you ask questions, if you empathize, if you validate emotions, and then you offer support, then I think all we need is permission, and permission allows you, I suppose, the capacity to develop confidence in opening up to have those more meaningful conversations. But I still think we need to be taught.
Yes. Yeah, the unstructured approach of the Mongrels Men. I flashed up the branding there for anyone who's thinking about that. The unstructured approach was interesting for me in the morning meetups. It's like, because I'm so used to a facilitated program where someone will ask a question or a thought-provoking question, or how do we get people involved? And it's like, we were just standing around drinking coffee. And I'm like, what's going to happen now? But it happens. And then the conversations just start to happen, which was really lovely as well. So.
Yeah, it's a genuinely supportive environment, like the guys that have been there a little bit longer know exactly what we're about. They know exactly how to kind of encourage an open conversation. Everyone's there for different reasons, but the idea of just creating a brave place for guys to be able to talk is simply the starting point. And then similar to our programs, we can kind of stack that education on top so that we can teach them how to have more meaningful conversations.
Yeah, and I don't think Scott's with us today. Yoga Scott. I could just look at the list of attendees. I can't see Scott with us, but I know Scott is involved heavily with the DY, and it was Scott who saw me having a coffee down there a few days later and came up and said, "Oh, g'day, Matt. How you going?" And it's just like these little connections are the thing that make such a huge difference. Tim, getting into if you'd like to move on to, sorry, is there anything else you want to say about mongrels before we move? I want to move on to workplace psychosocial hazards and psychosocial risks and things like that.
No, unless there's any questions that have popped up from
Yeah. Are there any
the
questions
audience.
at all?
Saw
There are
one
some things
from
coming
Matt.
in the chat. Sorry, I haven't been keeping an eye on the chat here. Beautiful. Catherine has asked specifically, is there anything closer to Western Sydney, closer to Parramatta, Mongrels Men?
So we are looking at growing in a range of locations. In fact, we would love to grow to 800 locations across the country in the next 5 years so that we could impact 1 million men over that period. And if we can get to 2,000 locations in the next 10 years, it means we can impact up to 1 million men in most postcodes across the country. That's where we want to go. But to answer your question, Catherine, whilst we're talking to a few people in and around those areas, we don't have anybody in those areas yet running our programs. So we would look for volunteer community champions to dedicate about 2 hours a week to turn up, put a banner in the ground, welcome new guys, make sure they get a coffee. And so we are looking for volunteers. If, Catherine, you know anybody in that area, please feel free to refer them through.
Absolutely. I've just put the website there as well. Actually, Tim, before we move on to the occupational, the workplace aspect and psychosocial risks, etc., could you please explain? This was a question I asked you when I first started getting involved with Mongrels. Why is it called Mongrels Men? Tell us about the branding, because I had some stories around that when I first saw you down at DY. You and the guys down at DY. Yeah.
So the origins of Mongrels came from 2008. Me and one of my best mates, James, who now runs Burleigh Heads for us, wanted to get away for a game of golf. We had to organise it 3 months in advance because we had family, friends, and work responsibilities. And so we went, we organised a couple of other blokes to join us. So, my brother and he organised some mates, and my sister organised for a boyfriend to bring some mates. And all of a sudden we had this motley crew of blokes that were all ages, demographics, shapes, sizes, colours and backgrounds. And of course, as soon as you go away with a bunch of blokes for a weekend for a couple of games of golf, it becomes a competition. Competition needs a trophy. Trophy needs a name. And because we were such a mixed bag of blokes, we went, well, we're just a pack of mongrels. And so that's how it started. And that golf day then evolved from 8 that year to 20 to 30 to 40. Now we get 100 to our charity event every year. But it's also meant to reinforce a couple of things. This idea of inner fight, the fight within the underdog, resilience, strength, grit. And the idea there being that we're obviously trying to help guys build those tools. Sometimes it is about toughing it out. Sometimes it's about adapting. But most importantly, this concept of connection and community draws on the idea that there's a significant amount of strength which comes from the pack. And that pack for us is the community. It is the other men in our groups. And it is the community more broadly, the Mongrels community more broadly. So we kept the name. Yep.
Yeah, nice. And I like how you built that into now the dog house where you do the other training, etc. Thanks, Melanie, for putting your comment here in the chat about not everyone can see that because it came just to host some panelists, but how you create a safe space for your husband to talk, to share, and you create that safe space just listening without judgment or giving solutions. So yeah, lovely that you can do that with your husband. And I see this question from Belinda around, how can women support their male friends, family, colleagues? I liked, Tim, how you suggested that often it might just be a kind female influence just to say, hey, why don't you go along to this event? Why don't you go and connect with some men? Why don't you do this? Just almost just a suggestion. And when you were describing that, Tim, I was thinking of it as like a friendly female, like a hand on the back with supporting the man into that, not pushing them into it, but just a support, just like I'm here with you. I've got my hand on my back. I want my hand on your back. Would you say anything else, Tim? I think the majority of people here are probably thinking, how can I support my male friends, my male husband, my male friends? Yeah,
Yeah,
how can we do that more?
yeah. Look, and there is a soft and gentle way to be able to do that. It's opening them up to the idea of developing community connections or connections with men, and it doesn't just have to be with something like Mongrels. It could be joining a social soccer team or a community-based sport or something where there is already a community built.
Yeah,
Um, I mentioned before, 60% of the men that come to us because of the impact of or the influence of a woman. And you'd know this, Matt, from attending DY. We have wives and partners that bring their husbands and partners down, drop them
yeah,
off, and then pick them back up again. And that's to make sure that it's built into the routine that they get outdoors, that they turn up,
yeah.
and that they make their way home safely. But you know,
Interesting. Because it
it,
is
it
uncomfortable.
is.
I've come down to DY and I've stood at the end of the beach thinking, oh, there's no one there yet. Oh, what will I do? Because even as someone who's quite mostly extroverted, there really is this barrier to just saying, hi, I'm here. Yeah, so that's an interesting point. Just saying, hey,
Do you remember the
I'll
first
go
time you
for a
came?
walk. Do I remember the first time? Ah,
Well, let me ask you another
yes.
question. Do you remember what happened the first time you came?
Yeah, someone gave me a hug.
Yeah.
I think it was Scott. I think Scott gave me a hug. Oh, you here? Oh, you here for the mongrels thing? Here, we hug here. Oh,
Yeah.
that's nice. Yeah, and we
So
went
we
for a walk.
always start and finish with a hug, and there's a reason for that. It's a nice icebreaker. It's an
Mm,
interesting way for the new guys to join. Which is why I asked if you remembered it. But your body also secretes and has a chemical reaction when humans touch. So dopamine, serotonin, amongst others, and it has there's a chemical reaction when humans touch. You got to hold it for 6 seconds to get the best
mhm.
output. You've got to hold it for 22. So you'll find that some of those hugs last a little bit longer than others, depending
Hug
upon the
is
groups
real.
you go to.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we're going to run out of time, which I knew we would. So if there's any questions, please put them in the chat. I want to also put up Tim's contact details for anyone that wants to get in touch with Tim. Whilst I put those on the screen, Tim, could you tell us a little bit about how this is playing out in the workplace? The
Yeah.
responsibility that employers have these days around mental health and psychosocial legislation, etc. I'd love to just hear a little bit about that. Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm doing a lot more work in this area, whether it's speaking to give mental health a voice or a face, so it becomes something real in terms of the way I would share my stories and lived experience in a lot more detail. But the legislation around workplace health safety was reviewed in 2018, updated in 2022. Each of the states and territories have been introducing legislation over the course of the last couple of years. But it is now the employer and the employee's responsibility to think about the psychosocial hazards in the workplace. So this, in its most simple, is essentially talking about anything that could cause psychological harm. And that is, when we talk about mental health, the way people think, feel, or behave. And we know that this is important because it's cases around psychological harm and injuries is much more significant than physical. The average return to work for a physical injury is between 6 to 8 weeks. For mental health related cases, it's between 30 to 33 weeks. It's more costly. It has a much bigger
Wow.
impact on the business.
Wow.
But
I
in
wasn't
its
aware
most
of that.
basic, it could be job demands, lack of job control, lack of job clarity, poor organisational change management, everything down to inadequate reward and recognition. There could be traumatic events that occur at work. Could be related to your working environment. So think, remote or isolated, not just, the physical injuries and impact. It could be conflict, aggression, bullying. It has the potential for us to have much more awareness around the way we interact with one another, the way we think about the engagement between humans, the way we have conversations, and the way we make people feel, because ultimately the psychosocial hazards, as they're outlined in the legislation, are open to interpretation, although Safe Work Australia provides us with some guidance. But it also means that, back to the point you raised before, we need to spend more time understanding mental health, understanding signs and symptoms so that we can identify, we can help prevent, and then if something does arise, we can then better help support for a happier, let's just call it healthier, more productive, and you love productivity, workplace.
Yeah. I mean, that's what we try to help with productivity, but the impact of the productivity training is always around reducing stress, improving our mental health. So that's where the productivity, that's why we're having this conversation in productivity land today as well.
Yeah.
That's fascinating, Tim, about the time frame to get back to work from mental ill health, and what we can do to start noticing it more. Does anyone have any comments, questions, ideas? Please put them in the chat. I mean, I think one of the biggest things as leaders, managers, people and culture, human resources, or just team leaders, it's creating the space. It really is around creating that space, having the conversations. Like, yeah, with many of the companies we work with have their EAP programs and things like that, but encouraging people to use them, just asking people to share what's going on. Like, to me, that's often just the way to get started as well. Just ask questions. What's going on in your personal life? Rather than just, how are you? Good. Let's keep moving. What's going on in your personal life? Tell me a little bit. Sharing articles of EAP. Yeah, cool. Nice. Thank you. Encouraging people to use their EAP services.
Yeah.
Thank you, Tim.
And ideally,
We're going to have to, I'm going to share a
go
couple
ahead.
more slides. Please feel free to keep talking. If anyone needs to leave, thank you so much for joining us. I just want to put up these resources that Tim kindly shared. And Tim, yeah, back to you. There's no rush.
Oh, I was just going to say, like, imagine a work environment where we didn't have to rely upon the safety net of an EAP, because we were all much better at communicating, connecting, being more aware and understanding. And so it's great that we've got EAP and it's a requirement for workplaces, but it tells you that there is a significant risk. But if we were able to better understand, be more supportive, be more aware, ideally we would need it less, and people would not have to get to the stage where they needed to reach out for help and support, which is the ideal outcome.
Yeah.
Maybe the last thing from me is, being Loneliness Awareness Week, I would probably encourage everybody on this call to do two things. And it's a bit of a challenge from me to you, having been in this position before where I've had no one to talk to. Go through your phone, scroll through your phone. By the end of today, find a family, friend or colleague that you haven't spoken to for a while, that you know might be challenged at the moment, and then give them a call by the end of this week. And I'll give you until Sunday, not tomorrow being Friday, or text them if you're not comfortable having that conversation. But just reach out, let them know you're thinking of them, that you care, and you'd be amazed at what might come back and the impact that can have.
Wonderful. What a great challenge. I'm going to take that challenge on as well, Tim. So thank you for that. Reach out to someone, ask them how they are. Thank you, Tim. Thank you, everyone, so much for joining us today. We could keep talking about this, but let's go and do some action. Like, let's do that thing. Let's go and reach out to someone. Catherine says, I've been meaning to call my brother. Beautiful. Yes, do it. Challenge accepted, Belinda. Thank you. Yeah, let's do it. Tim, thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for creating
Thanks,
Mongrels
Matt.
Men and all the beautiful messages, the important messages you're sharing around men's mental health. It's very close to my heart and a beautiful global humanity changing piece of work you're doing. So thank you. And thank you everyone for joining us. Please have a wonderful afternoon, and get in touch with Tim. I did put his email in the chat there, but I'll be sending out a follow-up email with the recording and these resources. Please get in touch with Tim or get in touch with me if you'd like any further information, and have a beautiful afternoon. Thanks again, Tim, and thanks everyone for coming.
Thanks all. Thanks for having me, Matt. Thanks all.
Pleasure.